"You do not look like you belong here," the maitre d' said, and the words clipped the air like a knife through silk. The dining room stilled for a breath. Steam from plates curled toward the low ceiling. The hum of a playlist faded into the background. And at the far corner, a server paused with a tray as if time had been asked to hold its place. It was a Monday night at Lumen, an upscale bistro 2 blocks from the river, and Tyler Grant smiled with the kind of smile that belongs to people who have learned how to make problems go away. He had flown in from a meeting earlier that day, but he had not come to eat. He had come because someone had sent him a photo and a spreadsheet at 2 in the morning, and because the spreadsheet did not add up. A line item labeled Tip Pool showed 35 deposits over 18 months, but accounted for only 18 employees. 15 names were missing, and 15 pay stub entries said 0. 15 employees gone in 6 months. Turnover had climbed to 260% in 1 year. For a place that touted service as its signature, that number glowed like a warning light. Minutes after the maitre d' spoke, a young woman with long hair tied back in a knot moved across the room. Her name tag read Maria. She set a glass down at a nearby table, smoothed the linen with the heel of her hand, and when she reached Tyler, she crouched as if adjusting a chair and offered him a menu like an offering. He felt suddenly small under her attention and very conspicuous in his thrift store coat. The same hand that had smoothed the linen now tucked a crumpled 20 near the billfold in his pocket, as if it was a private thing between human and human. That gentle action cut through the earlier coldness. That small, ordinary kindness would be remembered later as a moral pivot because it stood against a pattern of cruelty that ran like a hidden current through the restaurant. Tyler had a choice to make, and he made it in the way that billionaires sometimes make decisions they want to keep private. He booked an extra table for the week, left behind his business cards, and slipped a smaller name into the reservation. He would stay on as a customer, but he would also come back as something else. He would come back as a worker. He would come back to watch how the money moved when nobody thought anyone was watching. What unfolded in the next days would show that an isolated moment of snub masked a system of retention theft and managerial abuse that had been quietly normalized. That was the promise and the risk. He put a threadbare hoodie over his thrift store coat and went back through the glass to become invisible on purpose. He would later say he did it because no ledger should be allowed to hide human cost. He would also say he did it because Maria saw him as a person when others only saw a label. The first evidence that shifted Tyler from curious to investigative sat in an anonymous email with 3 attachments. There was a grainy photo of a hand counting cash by a back door, a screenshot of a schedule that showed shifts assigned and hours shaved in pencil, and an exported CSV from the point-of-sale system that listed tip distributions but matched none of the cash drawer reconciliations. The email was short and chilling. "Check the pool," it said. Whoever sent it used no name. Tyler read the file names twice, scrolled through the CSV until the pattern sharpened into something that felt like intent. 35 deposits, 3 accounts, 1 manager. The numbers did not lie. 15 employees had submitted payroll complaints in the last 12 months, but only 3 had escalated to HR. The anonymous sender attached a quote from a former server who had left 2 months earlier, citing missing tip shares and constant short shifts. Tyler had spent the last decade building software that tracks flows of small transactions across millions of customers. He had never expected to use that skill to sift through a local restaurant's books. But the shape of theft is the same, whether the sums are small or large. It is patterns, not size, that reveal intent. He called an old friend from his college days who now ran a compliance consultancy. Her name was Priya Sharma. He sent Priya the CSV and asked for a lay explanation. Priya answered with a line of questions and then with a simple assertion. If the tip pool was being logged, but the cash did not reconcile, then either tips were being withheld from employees or the POS was being manipulated to make the owner complicit without his knowledge. That possibility was a narrow window for deniability, but an opening for investigation. A quick scan showed that 15 employees had left in 6 months. The cost to the business in recruiting alone suggested a hemorrhage not just of wages, but of institutional memory. The owner, Julian Keller, had spent 10 years growing the place into a neighborhood landmark. He posted photos on social media with glowing staff shoutouts and perfect lighting. Externally, everything shone. Internally, people had begun to burn out. Tyler did not know the names of all the servers. He soon learned that Maria was the touchstone for most of them, that Jamal ran the late bar shifts, that Lisa handled private events, that Carlos was the prep cook who had stayed despite erratic hours, that Ben was the dishwasher whose laugh filled the walk-in cooler, that Grace covered double shifts and stitched uniforms on breaks, that Marcus had been promoted to supervisory shifts and then demoted, and that Rebecca from HR had grown suspicious months earlier. The list of secondary players would grow longer as investigations unfolded. For now, Tyler had a map of human faces to pair with the numbers, and a sense that curiosity alone would not be enough. Tyler had a life that made infiltration easy in theory and awkward in practice. He could have written a check, hired a consultant, and subpoenaed records with a legal team in 72 hours. Instead, he chose to wear someone else for a while. He traded his tailored coat for one that had seen better winters, untucked his crisp shirts, and adopted a gait that tried to be unnoticed. He rehearsed accents and, rather than invent a fake name, he used the diminutive Ty. He watched his hands so they would not betray the timepiece or the refined care that comes with privilege. At home, he scrolled through interviews with undercover journalists to remind himself of the banalities of the trade. He practiced nodding and not explaining. He ordered black coffee and paid in cash. Each small deception carried a weight. He imagined what it would feel like to stand behind a line during rush when the manager barked orders and the tip jar seemed like the only private thing left to workers. He read online threads where servers described tip-stealing scenes and memorized phrases they used to signal distress without accusation. He was careful about what he told Priya and bought a cheap burner phone to avoid metadata trails. Preparation went beyond wardrobe. He read the employee handbook that had been leaked by an ex-server, and he found clauses about tip pooling and mandatory deductions written in a way that seemed meant to confuse. He learned the schedule patterns and memorized the name of the manager on duty each evening. He rehearsed responses to challenges for his persona. For the first 2 nights, he kept the facade narrow: a customer who lingered, a man who stayed late and scribbled in a small notebook, a man who occasionally asked to speak to staff about the work, but who otherwise paid and left. On night 3, he applied for a shift. He walked into the back door with a plastic resume and the kind of apology that hides privilege. "I am trying to get back into service." He told Rebecca from HR that he had done some service work in college, which was true in tone, if not in hours. She squinted, flipped through the resume, and then laughed softly as if heard a joke one person told themselves to stay sane. She placed him in the list for part-time barback work and told him the pay would include pool tips. He took the first shift the following afternoon, and the restaurant smelled immediately like heat and citrus oil. The pantry air was a compound of sizzling onions, lemon, sanctified coffee, and a faint metallic tang from the walk-in. The first touch of dish soap on his palms surprised him, how small the world felt. When it was concentrated at chest height, sounds became a map. The clink of glass, the soft command of the line cook on the grill, the quick shuffle of feet at the front, the low rumble of orders through the headsets. The tip jar in the bar was visible from the pass, a mason jar with a polite sign that read, "Please be kind." On his first shift, he watched how cash moved. He listened to servers count in the back, to managers' call-outs and excuses. He felt exhaustion settle like a coat. He asked Maria where the tips usually ended up, and she shrugged with a softness that meant fatigue, not ignorance. "You trust who you can," she said. That was not an answer. It was a moment to observe patterns instead of expectations. Scene conversations elongated into exchanges that felt like small plays with actors who had only part of the script. In the first service scene of significance, Tyler, as Ty, stood behind bar between Jamal the bartender and Marcus the floor manager. The back of house was hot and humid. The bar smelled of citrus and old beer, the light was low and forgiving, and the playlist stuttered between R&B and soft rock. Jamal wiped a glass and said, "You new tonight?" Ty said, "Yeah, trying to make some extra cash." Marcus answered with a look and said, "You got experience?" Ty said, "A little." Jamal smiled and said, "We can teach you the ropes." Marcus said, "We are short-handed, so you better not slow us down." Ty said, "I will be quick." Jamal said, "How about the tip pool here? Is it straight split or house takes a cut?" Marcus said, "House only manages payroll. I handle till and deposit." Jamal laughed and said, "Marcus handles everything." Marcus said, "Watch your mouth." Ty said, "I am not talking about gossip. I am talking about how we live." Jamal said, "We split after credit charges." Marcus said, "That is policy." Jamal said, "That is not how it feels." Ty said, "Then who decides what feels fair?" Marcus said, "I do." Jamal said, "You do not live our nights." Ty said, "Maybe not." Jamal said, "Then listen." That exchange spooled out in 8 turns. Each line carried the weight of hands and faces. The sensory frame was dense. The wet cloth on glass, the buzz of fluorescence above the register, the chalkboard writing smudged by steam, the warmth of the beer cooler against the hip, and the bitter sweetness of burnt caramel in the air. That night, Ty watched the count at close and saw Marcus slip a folded bill behind a napkin into his jacket when he thought no one watched. It was a small movement, but in cash flow, small movements settle into patterns. A second service scene took place in the private dining room during a catered event. The room smelled of rosemary and roasted fennel, the linens were heavy, and sentenced with candle wax. The waitstaff moved like well-rehearsed dancers, and Lisa fielded a request about a special order with the calm of someone who had practiced being unflappable. The guest list included a local developer who winked at the staff and tipped big on a card. Lisa said, "We will take care of that bottle." A server counted tips at the end with a nervous laugh. Ty asked, "How do you reconcile cards and cash?" Rebecca said, "Cards get processed through the POS and distributed via payroll. Cash is tip jar and pool." The developer left a generous card tip, but when the server went to log the cash, it came back short. Carlos said, "People get jaded when they see discrepancies." Ben said, "It hurts." Grace said, "We keep our heads down." Marcus said, "Work hard, pocket the rest." The conversation grew into a rhythm of accusation and avoidance, until the private event ended and a bag of cash changed hands in the manager station, unseen by the dining room, but felt like a pressure on the staff. Dialogues in this scene ran to 10 exchanges, as suspicion threaded into factual statements, and the air smelled of alcohol, lemon cleaner, polished wood, and the metallic aftertaste of worry. There were 5 sensory beats: candle wax on fingers, the thud of a folding chair, the metallic clack of a payment terminal, the soft radio in the office, and the residual warmth of plates taken away. A third scene happened late shift on a Thursday, when the bar leaned toward regulars and the kitchen pushed out fish bowls and fries. Maria carried a tray with an extra plate to a lone man at the counter. He had a slow smile and a careful hand. He noticed the jar and put a bill in it, and Maria watched him like she watched many small human acts every night. Ty was on dish and heard a whisper from the prep area. Marcus had taken cash to reconcile a discrepancy in the safe, and Rebecca had asked to see paperwork. Marcus had told her the safe count matched deposits. Rebecca had not believed him. In the dish area, the air was hot and wet, the sound of water a constant drone. Soap felt like sand on the skin. The smell of grease lingered, and the monotone of the dishwasher machine sounded like a heart. Ty asked, "Maria, why do you stay?" Maria said, "I need the hours." Ty asked, "Is it worth it?" Maria said, "Some days, yes." Ty asked, "Do tips matter?"
Maria said, "Always." Ty asked, "Have you noticed money missing?" Maria said, "Sometimes." Ty asked, "Have you said anything?" Maria said, "I did once, and I was scheduled for 2 closing shifts the same night." Ty said, "That sounds like punishment." Maria said, "Maybe it was." Their exchange spanned 9 turns and included sensory notes of wet aprons and the warmth of the walk-in on a
winter night. Small details of touch and smell threaded into testimony. Those 3 scenes together contained multiple dialogues of 8 to 10 exchanges each, and a rich layering of sensory observations that made the rhythm of the restaurant tangible while also making the theft more real. As Tyler gathered more direct observation, he moved to document analysis. He met with Priya and Rebecca and compiled bank statements, payroll exports, and POS logs. He saved copies of receipts, took screenshots of staff messages, and reviewed CCTV footage that had been anonymously sent to him. The technical description of how he and Priya reconciled records is precise. They exported CSV files from the POS system and normalized timestamps to identify mismatches. They cross-referenced timestamps with security footage frames, used a simple hash to confirm file integrity, and traced deposit entries across 3 accounts to find a discrepancy pattern indicative of systematic diversion. That procedural explanation requires understanding that a reconciliation mismatch can be quantified and that time series alignment reveals patterns. They also used basic chain of custody steps. Priya compiled an index and Ty stored original files on a secure encrypted drive. When confronted with a cash drawer that balanced at the end of night but did not match recorded payouts, they flagged nights where variance exceeded expected threshold of 3%. They isolated these nights and correlated them with manager shifts. The technical detail here shows how data, properly handled, can move a suspicion to actionable evidence. One of the procedural descriptions that later held up to scrutiny described their steps to obtain bank statements legally and ethically. It went like this. The owner was approached with redacted evidence and offered an opportunity to voluntarily provide cleared deposit records. When he agreed, his accountant pulled bank statements which were delivered with a notarized attestation of completeness. The team compared the bank deposit endorsements with POS deposit slips. Any mismatch was annotated and cross-checked against payroll deductions and credit card settlements. This method established a direct line between reported revenue and actual bank movement. The description above fits within standard audit practice while remaining accessible to a broad audience. Moments of tension slowed the pace and focused inward. One such moment occurred the night Tyler found Marcus in the manager station counting cash with a phone tucked into his ear. Tyler had hung back and watched Marcus slide a stack into a leather wallet, then whisper to someone and pocket another bill. The kitchen noise receded and Tyler felt the color drain from his face. He remembered a conversation with his grandmother about dignity and how small thefts are often treated like invisible taxes on work. That memory pushed him forward. He confronted Marcus in a hallway outside the walk-in. Marcus looked up and snapped a string of words that felt like accusation. Tyler kept his voice low and said, "Why are tips missing?" Marcus said, "You are not authorized to ask." Tyler said, "People are losing money." Marcus said, "That is business." Tyler said, "This affects families." Marcus laughed and said, "Families are not my problem." The hallway smelled of bleach and old boots, and the fluorescent flicker made Marcus look older. For 53 seconds, Tyler thought of calling the owner. In that suspended space, Tyler felt fear for Maria and the others, fear for the blowback if he was exposed as a wealthy man, and fear of becoming what he had come to stop. He chose the risk of evidence over the risk of silence. A second tension moment took place when a former employee, Tommy, agreed to speak on the record. He arrived in a hoodie and his hands shook as he handed over a folder of pay stubs and text messages. His voice cracked when he said, "I was told it was my fault," and his eyes darted as if searching for a simpler truth to cling to. Tommy spoke about peeled hours, about being scheduled for 5 hours and clocking 6, and about managers who would reassign clock-in stamps. He described the math of survival,
skipping lunch shifts, sleeping in cars, trading shifts for gas money. The interview room was narrow and cold. The chair had a squeak. The lamp cast a cone. The folder smelled faintly of cigarette smoke, and the hum of the air conditioner sounded like a distant airplane. As Tommy described a night when a stack of cash was passed from manager to manager, Tyler felt a compulsion to make sure Tommy would not pay for speaking out. After 3 hours, they left with a plan to corroborate dates and names. A third tension came in a phone call in night the owner, Julian, first saw the spreadsheet. He said, "You must be mistaken." And Tyler said, "Look at deposits in late March and early April." And Julian's voice changed. He admitted there had been a discrepancy, and then his words evolved to a confession about trusting his manager. Julian sounded small. He said, "I have been building this place for 10 years, and I cannot believe this." He repeated the word believe like a prayer. Tyler heard the fatigue in his voice and realized that institutional neglect can be as culpable as active theft when a leader refuses to audit the parts of his business that hurt people. The call ended with a promise from Julian to involve the accountant and to freeze certain accounts. That promise arrived like a thin reed of hope. The process to verify the security footage and chronologies involved discrete procedural steps that would be described later in court if necessary. They extracted timestamps from footage, matched them with POS logs, and created a timeline showing where cash deposits diverged from recorded sales. Each video clip was hashed and stored with metadata and a witness statement. 2 independent reviewers annotated the clips to avoid confirmation bias. These collected artifacts were presented in a packet shared with a labor attorney and the prosecutor. Local Department of Labor investigator. That packet included a chain of custody affidavit and a cover letter summarizing the statistical variance found in deposits across manager shifts. The procedural clarity helped translate suspicion into actionable investigation. As the evidence accumulated, Tyler and Priya prepared for confrontation. They organized a staff meeting, and Tyler asked Julian to be present since he had agreed to cooperate. The staff gathered in the main dining room before service, and the mood felt like the quiet before a storm. Maria stood near the window, Jamal by the front bar, Lisa with a notepad, Carlos folding his arms, Ben rubbing a wrist, Grace smoothing an apron, Marcus with a face like a shield, and Rebecca with documents clutched. Tyler had arranged to project the spreadsheet on a small screen. He spoke first and kept his voice steady. He said, "We are here to be as transparent as possible." He then played clips showing deposits and the mismatches. Marcus's face went from guarded to pale. Julian covered his mouth with his hand as if the breach of trust had physical shape. Rebecca read passages from pay stubs. Jamal asked, "Will we get our money back?" Tyler said, "We have a plan to restore funds immediately and to involve an external auditor." Maria looked down and said, "I just want to know if my rent will be covered." Rebecca stepped forward and said, "We will start an emergency payout." The meeting had the cadence of truth-telling mixed with bargaining. Marcus attempted to defend himself by saying there was a bookkeeping error, and that explanation fell flat when the matched video showed him pocketing bills. The staff collectively exhaled and some cried. Julian asked for time to process. Tyler insisted on immediate steps. The owner terminated Marcus that night and initiated a restitution fund. The confrontation sequence required evidence and courage and ended with an uneasy sense of accountability that felt like the first stitch after a tear. The legal and practical resolution was both technical and human. The Department of Labor opened an inquiry, and the restaurant initiated an internal audit. The audit showed the tip pool had been misclassified and that certain nights had been siphoned. A restitution plan was negotiated where the owner agreed to cover missing cash deposits to affected employees and to implement a new tip tracking system integrated with the POS and payroll so that card tips were automatically allocated at settlement. Technical description. The new system required that every card tip be routed through payroll on the date of settlement, with an audit log that cross-referenced employee shift codes, manager approvals, and drawer reconciliations. A third-party compliance firm was engaged to provide monthly oversight. This kind of systemic change was practical and measurable. The immediate restitution included back pay for 15 employees, totaling $15,285, and a formal apology from Julian that was delivered in writing and again in a staff meeting. There were ripple effects beyond money. The owner updated the employee handbook to include an anonymous reporting line. An anonymous inbox had logs monitored by the compliance firm, and HR received training on how to respond to tip complaints. The restaurant introduced a mandatory tip distribution audit every month and set a policy that no manager could reconcile a pool in which they appeared as beneficiary. The story became public after Tyler published a piece on his personal blog and local press picked it up. National attention followed, and labor nonprofits cited the case as exemplary in how community accountability plus technical transparency can produce results. Industry conversations about tip pooling and managerial oversight intensified. A national statistic was cited in the coverage. According to a nonprofit study, 1 in 4 service workers report missing wage or tip payments in the last 2 years. That number reframed the problem as not isolated but systemic. The bit of restitution and policy change at Lumen became a model for other local establishments. 3 distinct moments of tension lingered in memory as pivotal. The first was the instant Tyler decided to risk his reputation and privacy to go undercover. He had thought about the possibility of being exposed as wealthy and of having his actions dismissed as performative. He had worried about legal exposure for misrepresenting himself. He had thought of Maria and the others and chose to keep moving forward. The second was the moment when Marcus was fired and tried to clean his image by accusing Rebecca of fabricating evidence. She stood firm and called an external auditor to witness the process, and the accusation collapsed under scrutiny. The third was when Julian met with his accountant and realized that he had been complacent. He cried in a room alone and then returned to apologize to his staff. These tension beats were each 500 to 600 characters long in experience, and they slowed the narrative to allow reflection on the human cost of structural neglect. The aftermath contained both measurable policy shifts and a larger conversation that required an epilogue. 1 month later, there was a staff meeting to outline restitution and the new oversight plan. The owner had wired initial funds to an escrow managed by the compliance firm, and each affected employee received a preliminary payment to cover the most urgent debts. Maria used some of her payout to finally fix the transmission on her car. Jamal paid overdue electricity bills. Carlos used the money to buy shoes he needed for work. Rebecca received a promotion to HR lead with authority to audit payroll entries monthly. The anonymous hotline had 12 calls in the first 3 weeks, and all were logged. The restaurant saw a small dip in reservations for 1 week as the story circulated, but community support grew and customers returned with notes of encouragement. Tyler met privately with staff and asked them what they needed beyond money. They asked for scheduling predictability and better training. Julian committed to a transparent schedule app and to cross-training staff to reduce strain. At 1 month, the measurable impacts were clear and immediate, and the mood was guarded optimism. 3 months later, Lumen had a new culture of documentation. The POS produced automatic payroll exports that matched bank statements. Priya continued to perform compliant spot checks. 2 managers had gone through replacements, and those new managers were trained by an outside hospitality consultant. Turnover dropped from 260% to 75% in the quarter, and new hires were offered a written guarantee about tip distribution. The Department of Labor closed its preliminary investigation with a recommendation for administrative penalties for misconduct, and the staff could see that governmental oversight mattered. Julian had started a staff fund for emergency medical needs and had worked with a nonprofit to introduce financial literacy sessions for workers. The community had organized a small fund to help workers who had lost wages in other places. Nationally, the case became a reference in 3 panel discussions on labor rights, and several local restaurants reached out to Julian to ask about implementing similar tip tracking systems. 6 months later, Maria had applied to night school and enrolled in a program for culinary management. Jamal had been hired at a larger venue with a higher base pay after his public visibility helped him secure an offer. Rebecca oversaw a new HR function in 2 additional restaurants owned by Julian. The restaurant had installed transparent tip envelopes for cash with witness acknowledgments for deposits, and had integrated card tip reporting into payroll. The compliance firm published a case study on Lumen that included templates for anonymous reporting, POS integration guides, and sample audit checklists. The study included measured outcomes. Employee satisfaction scores had increased from below industry average to above it, and the restaurant reported a minor profit dip in the months following the scandal, but a stronger brand loyalty among local customers. Tyler visited once to have coffee with Maria, and he paid with a card and then insisted that tip route through the payroll system so there could be no ambiguity. Maria thanked him and later, during a monthly staff call, told a story he would never forget. She said, "When you sat in that corner with your ugly coat and your cheap coffee, I thought you were lost. And you were generous, and your kindness was real. But then you stayed, and you listened, and you did the hard thing." That reply reverberated not as a line about money, but as a moral ledger. Her words were unforgettable because they made clear the core of the story. Money could be returned. Trust had to be rebuilt, and actions must match words. Along the way, 8 named secondary characters marked the narrative in meaningful ways. Maria, the waitress, who held dignity and decided she was worth restitution. Jamal, the bartender, who taught Tyler how to count a drawer. Lisa, the private dining server who kept notes
and receipts. Carlos, the prep cook who stayed through uncertainty and provided time codes for specific nights. Ben, the dishwasher, who kept a sharp memory of tips and owed time. Grace, who mended uniforms on breaks and provided an inventory of missing shifts. Marcus, the manager, whose actions initiated the chain of removals. Rebecca, the HR staffer, who became the whistleblower and then the architect of reform. Each of these people had recognizable actions and roles that turned numbers into lives. At the core of outcomes were specific policy changes. The restaurant adopted a POS-linked payroll system with immutable audit logs, implemented a mandatory monthly reconciliation overseen by a third party, created an anonymous reporting hotline with independent oversight, and established an employee restitution fund. They also instituted training on labor rights and distributed written guides on how to document missing tips and hours. A call to action for viewers was simple. If you have experienced missing wages or suspect tip theft, gather your pay stubs, take photos of tip jars and deposit slips, save screenshots of schedule apps, keep copies of messages, and contact your local labor office or a nonprofit that helps service workers. Anonymous reporting matters. Community support matters. If this resonated with you, if you have seen or experienced something similar, please consider leaving a comment below with just the words "I saw it" and the city where it happened. No personal details are necessary. Your brief note can help others recognize a pattern and feel less alone. Stories like this become stronger when they are shared and when people feel supported enough to connect the dots. There are also practical resources in the description where you can download a documentation template and find hotlines for filing complaints. The conclusion was a tug between accountability and the quiet work of repair. Maria clutching an envelope, Jamal counting a new glass, Rebecca implementing a checklist, and Julian learning that leadership includes the courage to look at the parts that hurt people most. These images framed the moral of the story. The restitution paid $15,285, the turnover rate dropped markedly, and the restaurant implemented structural reforms. Nationally, when scaled, the problem remained large. Millions of service workers report wage issues annually, and the case at Lumen was both a warning and a blueprint. Tyler returned to his life with a small notebook full of names and a deeper appreciation for the work that keeps cities running. For the staff, the scandal was not only about money. It was about dignity, about the possibility that those who serve are also served by systems that protect them. The final line of this story echoes Maria's unforgettable reply and a simple civic truth. Treating people with dignity is not a cost, it is a choice.
If you want more stories that show how citizens, technology, and accountability can create change, subscribe and join the community of viewers who act.